Today I am joined by Dr. Michael Therrien, who is the President and CEO of the Preambula Group. And Dr. Therrien is a moral theologian. He's a professor. He served as the academic dean for the Augustine Institute. He's also served as the president of the Institute for Pastoral Leadership and the director of evangelization for the Diocese of Pittsburgh. So he brings a wealth of knowledge, understanding, and experience to a great conversation that we're going to have on two important topics. One is the battle between the culture of fear and the culture of faith. And the second is, how can we answer the crisis that we have in Catholic leadership today? Check it out.
The whole world is sick.
Are you worried about America? I am.
Believe the impossible and you can do the incredible.
Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Catholic Patriot, and I'm delighted to have back again an old friend, Dr. Michael Therrien. And you might remember him from about a year ago when we had him on. We were just launching our kind of previous versions of our podcast, and we were talking about evangelization, and it was an interview that was so well received. I loved the comments that we had at the time. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Therrien back here. I'm going to put him on the screen right there. He joins us all the way across the country in Pittsburgh, PA. So welcome back, Michael. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's good to be back. Good to see you.
I know, we're very busy in our lives, and so it's like this is an opportunity also just to catch up, it seems. But
yeah.
But the why I love having you on is because you are such a grounded Catholic thinker, a critical thinker, and I always find that you provide something at an angle that I'm not quite thinking of. That's really just what the audience is looking for. And as we go into these into 2022 and our times just get a little bit crazier, I'm looking for those voices, those leaders who can help us get our bearings on a couple of things. One is what really is going on in our world today. And when we look at the church, we look at what's going on in the world, and already we're overwhelmed. And what is important for Catholics to be thinking, and what kind of grounding and mindset should we have going into this year? And one of the themes when we were talking ahead of time was this kind of a war. Like I was thinking about it. I was like, well, yeah, it's like a culture of fear versus a culture of faith, and there's a lot packed into those phrases. But I'd really love to get your thoughts on what we could be thinking about right now to help us, because I find that most Catholics are usually, in one camp or the other and not having a proper balance. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, first of all, I want to say that everything I'm going to say is really the fruit of struggling with everyone else and working through the craziness of our times. There's just so much going on, and I talk to my wife a lot about this, and it's like, the world just isn't what it was even 10 years ago, and or even 5 years ago, quite honestly, even that recently. It's just everything is accelerated, and there's an oppression that's pressing down on the world right now, and I spend a lot of time in prayer trying to discern God's will in all this. Like, what is going on? And not that I have any certain answers about that. I mean, like I know the mind of God, but it's clear. One thing is clear to me is we have an opportunity right now. So it's like all the footholds, we're losing the footholds that we had even 10, 15 years ago. There's a lot of turmoil within the church for a whole lot of reasons. Governments are increasingly unreliable, or at least we're seeing the unreliability of them more and more. I'm not sure they're any more unreliable than they were before. Maybe we just didn't see it as clearly, but now it just seems. But I don't know. It's hard to sort that out. But like just things going on in our governmental institutions. I mean, we could talk for a while about the whole COVID thing and the changes between administrations and how fast everything can change when one person comes into office. That's just makes your head spin. Quite frankly, you're like, and then there's also just certain cultural value systems that are just being pushed so hard. The whole wokeism and all that's going on, and it's shocking to me how much people are just buying into this or tapping out of the conversation and just putting their heads in the sand. And I'm not talking about Catholics there specifically, but just around in the culture. It's like when I was teaching high school in the early 90s, the issues that young people are dealing with today wouldn't have even crossed our minds. And that's not that long ago. Maybe it's 20 some years ago, but that doesn't feel like that long ago. And well, is it 20? Maybe it's more than that. I'm not good with math, but you get my point. It's like there's this acceleration. So I think why I introduced to you the possibility of talking about the sort of faith-fear thing is that when we're in unsettling times and there's a lot of change and there's turmoil, the natural human instinct is to be afraid and to hunker down, lock ourselves in the bunker and try to construct narratives for ourselves that provide enough explanation for us to feel like we're sane people in the midst of complete chaos. And I can honestly say, like last year, as we were approaching the last election, I was looking in a lot of interesting places to try to figure out what is going on here. And I remember I had a conversation. I called up. It was right at the beginning of the summer when all the riots started happening and, our cities were aflame. And I called up one of the members of the diocesan exorcism team in Pittsburgh, an old friend of mine. He's a layman, and he runs the exorcist office there. I asked him, I was like, Adam, can you, what do you think is happening and going on here? And he made it very clear that, from his sort of spiritual and I think quite mystically, grounded place. He's a very spiritually mature man with some extraordinary gifts. So I really trust his word. But he's like, it's clear that the Father in heaven is not pleased with the direction that the world is going. And he's disciplining the world right now. He's allowing things to happen so that we can really feel what it's like to try to go it alone without the grace of God. And I said, well, what do you do? And he says, well, I just spend a lot of time before the Blessed Sacrament and pray. And I'm like, that seems, overly simplistic. But over a year and a half or a year later, more than that, I find myself seeing the wisdom in what he's saying, because one of the things that I've experienced and undergone over the last year and a half is just a lack of peace and the loss of peace in my soul, because my attention and my focus is just constantly on everything that's going wrong out there in the world. And so in my own prayer, the Lord keeps saying, please explain to me what good you're doing for me and for the kingdom of God by being constantly stirred up and constantly sideways with all your anxiety and worry about where the world's going. And that's been quite arresting for me personally. I've had to really humble myself before the Lord and saying, that's a good question, Lord. I don't know what good I'm doing, because there's no peace in my heart, and I don't know where my faith is right now. I mean, certainly I believe in the faith and I believe in you, but my heart seems to be lagging way behind my head here. And I know that for me to be an effective witness of the gospel today, I've got to be living in a place of peace. And for me to have peace, I've got to have faith. Like, I have to have complete confidence that you know exactly what's going on, that you're allowing all of these things to happen, and that you're loving us through it all, and you're bringing us to a better place. Because you can't do anything other than that. But to live in that place of faith is very, very hard, especially if you're reading news feeds, or you're watching what's going on, and you're seeing things that are scary and crazy, and even potentially tyrannical. So anyway, I'll pause there, but that's kind of how I would set us up here in terms of just an initial response.
The whole fear reality, though, I find it very interesting because it really is at the heart of the war that we're in. And this is when I use that word war, I mean, it is real. And I use this quote all the time. I remind people what Fulton Sheen said, back in the 40s, where he says, we are living in the times of the apocalypse, the last days of our era, and the two great forces of the mystical body of Christ and the mystical body of Antichrist are now drawing up their battle lines. And then John Paul II is 1976. We are living in the final confrontation. This is before he was Pope. He's addressing America in almost the same words of Sheen. He said, most people are completely oblivious to this. It's in God's providence, but we have to take it up courageously. And then Sister Lucia writes to Cardinal Caffarra and says the final battles between the Lord and Satan is over marriage and the family. So we see all these things here, and we know that it's a culture of death versus a culture of life. But the filling in of those gaps, a lot of people, other than, of course, the abortion, which is the biggest. I mean, I think that's the ultimate justice that we are paying for right now, 1.2 plus billion babies since '83 worldwide. But the filling in of what what does the kingdom of God look like, and what is God's agenda? But what is the agenda of the anti-kingdom? I mean, Jesus says really clearly, no one goes into a war without calculating the enemy. And I think that we have, in our most modern time, maybe the last 15 years or so, grossly underestimated what we were up against. And now it's here, and it's what St. Paul talks about with the marks of Antichrist, the spirit of lawlessness is confusion, deception, and then ultimately he uses it for death. The devil, Satan, is a liar and he's a murderer. So he lies and then he kills. And when we talk, those of us who are out there trying to help the rest of the Catholics in the world to understand how this is playing out, it's crazy, because in the name of, I don't want to take it, that's, the escape clauses, that's doom and gloom, they then set back and they either believe the fear of the lies that are out there that are destroying humanity and every element in how we are and who we are as humans, socializing, our ability to control our health, our ability to think for ourselves, and yet they're buying into that. And we've there's like this hypnosis has come over a vast majority of Catholics. I think, this is my own opinion, I think Catholics are kind of the worst culprits in this, and it's coming from the top down, submitting to these agenda that are in the end anti-human in the name of humanity, climate, earth, creation, all these kinds of things. It's really kind of a moment of insanity. So you have this fear of, I don't want to know the truth, but yet I'm going to accept the fear that I can't do anything in my life and I have to do all these things that they're telling me, and I can't question it. And if you question it, you're the enemy. We've kind of entered this twilight zone, And then there's a third element of fear, is the gift of fear of the Lord that we don't speak about. And I love the way it's described in the litany for Pentecost, or the novena for Pentecost, it's a loving reverence towards God that I would dread in any way to displease him. In other words, that I would fail to live what he's created me for, And so, anyway, this seems to be the battle over the mind, like how people are thinking, because that's how the devil's getting to everything else, and is our health and ultimately our spirit. So those are my thoughts on that, and I don't know where you want to go with that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. Just a couple of sort of remarks, I guess. Fear, the unhealthy fear. I mean, that is living in fear, like being afraid of what's going on around us. The Lord says, "Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body, and be afraid of the one who can destroy everything." Right? And so when we act out of fear, we're going to seek security. And what's happening is people are seeking security in compliance, compliance with, universal mandates, for example, that make us feel safe and make us feel like we're doing the right thing to be a caring person. And then, but the question is that the point is that when we operate out of fear, we don't reason clearly, for one. And we can be rash and impulsive and reactive and all sorts of things. So it's a crisis of faith that we're experiencing today. Like, in other words, what's going on in the world today is because of a lack of faith in God and the world. That's why we're putting the world together the way we are. That's why we're interpreting events the way we are, because we don't see through the eyes of faith. So the Christian response to this, like the antidote to the darkness that we see out there, and to the reordering of things according to a different set of premises and principles, which are, let's face it, they're largely of a kind of socialist. I mean, that's the only other. I always say that
completely
socialism,
communist. I mean, they are to the core.
Yes. So socialism is just is Satan's parody of the kingdom of God. Like, that's the best he can come up with is to make a parody of all the elements and dimensions and characteristics of God's kingdom, and create a parody of those things and deceive us by making us think that we're pursuing God's purposes by embracing a socialist vision of the world. It's like, but that's not the kingdom of heaven. That's the kingdom of darkness, because it does such violence to the dignity of the human person on every level. But the antidote to it is there's three things that the devil can't. He just has no counteroffensive to, and we forget this. And it's very simple. It's faith. It's trusting in God, really trusting in God, entrusting our lives to God, not holding to an objective understanding of the doctrines of the Catholic faith. It's, do I get up every single day and entrust my heart to the loving, caring providence of the Lord and know that He's got this? And then let go of all the angst and all the worry and step into the world with complete confidence that this is God's world. He's won. He's got a plan. It's playing itself out. Because if I don't show up in that way, then I'm not helpful to Him in any way. I'm not building anything. I'm part of the problem. I have to have hope. That's the second. That means that I have to believe in the future promises that the Lord has extended to us, which means that I can bear whatever hardships that I face and adversity and inconvenience and difficulties with a joyful spirit, because I know that whatever I'm enduring now is not the final word. Like, this will break through to a new day. There's a great, I love, it's one of my favorite scenes from Lord of the Rings, when, and I always cite it because it almost makes me weep every time I read it in the story. But when Sam and Frodo are going across, the plains of Daggerlad or whatever, to Mount Doom, whatever that is, Mordor, they're crossing those terrible plains, and there's a horrible stench, and they can't find clean water really, and it's just a desolate place. It's awful. That's kind of how we feel right now. Sam, instead of despairing, he looks up to the heavens and he sees a star that's twinkling in the sky. It's the Star of Arendelle, and it gives him hope, because he realizes that above, in the heavens, above all of this craziness down below that he has to endure, there's a realm that just cannot be touched by everything that's going on down here. And that light, that hope becomes the strength that he has to continue. And it's the strength that ultimately gives him the capacity to carry Fredo up Mount Doom and try to get the job done. Well, that's Christian hope. We know that the kingdom of God can't be really touched by the darkness of the world, actually, for real. And if we think we can, it can be tainted, or then we don't have the faith we need because we don't know what we're talking about. So we have to have hope in that future promise and carry the cross that God's given us to bear right now, which is not easy. It's heavy. But we also then have to have love. That's the third thing that the enemy can't touch. He has no counteroffensive to faith, hope, and love. And that's why, basically Paul tells us, we got to armor up, people. We got to armor up with the theological life, as it were. And in the power of the Spirit, we got to not cower and hunker down and comply and conform to the spirit of this age. We have to step out there with boldness and courage, and we have to love the hell out of this world. And that's really, I say that very literally, like we have to be the agents of light that scatters the darkness. We have to be the agents of love that counters all of the fear and the hatred and the divisiveness and all of that. But what we tend to do as Catholics is we tend to hunker down and we go into a place of judgment and we're wringing our hands and we're so focused on what the enemy is doing, we forget our calling. We just forget and we get buried in all that. And I'm saying all this not because like I said at the beginning, not because I've got it all sorted out and I'm just sitting here preaching at everybody. This is the daily battle of my heart every single day as we live through this time right now, is to go to the Lord and say, Lord, there isn't peace in my heart today because I just streamed all of the headlines and what's going to happen with this, what's going to happen with that, and blah, blah, blah. I'm so afraid. What's happening in my country? What's happening in my church? What's happening? And it's, of course, it's not my country or my church. I guess I should catch myself right there. But the point is it's the wrong set of questions to ask. It should be, Lord, how can I build your kingdom today? What do you need me to do? How do you want to deploy me so that I can be a vessel of your grace to whatever little influence I can have in this day to day, to be a joyful warrior of your way of seeing things and your way of wanting things to come together as the image and likeness of your love and your goodness. So anyway, I mean, I know that I probably sounds kind of preachy, and I don't mean to sound that way, but I'm really being honest when I say that that's the war that I'm fighting in my own soul, because I'm a very melancholic person, and it is so easy for me to just go into the pits, and to just go, it's hopeless, but it's not. And we have to remind ourselves that it's not. We're just going through a time in history right now where our Heavenly Father is calling us to conversion and deeper faith, everyone. And He's allowing us to suffer in many ways so that we can come to know Him more intimately and more deeply.
That whole question of faith and action, what do we do? People hunkering down, an escapism that we often see. Excuse me. I think that's probably one of the greater scandals that we have, I think, is the fact of inaction. We're all critics, but very few are willing to be the man in the arena. I really love that passage from Teddy Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And if you are the man in the arena, you're basically crucified by your own, because you're fighting the battle that they don't want to fight, and it's your love for them. And I remember before we started our podcast, I mentioned it in our lead up to the topic as far as this sense of quietism that is kind of a replacement of like, that's how I'm going to be heroic, is I have to weather this. Okay, well, we all want to weather it. But try weathering something when you're on the battlefield. Like, who's going to be on the battlefield? Who's going to actually fight for the kingdom of God? And what does that fight look like? And that's kind of what leads me to my next question is, What are the responsibilities of Catholics today? Well, it's just granted, we are all called to pray. And I always tell people, you want to know the simplified plan, it's Fatima. Do that. Offer sacrifices, making reparation every day in any way you can. If you can, fast Wednesdays, Fridays, pray a rosary every day. Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. The angel taught the children of adoration at a time of godlessness. So we see those spiritual things. But for those who are in the apostolic dimension of our life, what is that responsibility? Because knowledge is responsibility, and yet we're on a back line. We're letting everybody, the rest of the world in politics and economics, and that which so many people are convinced that that's where the battle is going to be won. It's not. But they're playing that, and we're just sort of like, as long as you don't draft me, I got your back. But what are our responsibilities at a time where knowledge today, not just theological, we're talking health, the things that give us life. Everything under life is under attack. The devil's right now, he's targeting health, and people are falling for it. And I don't sugarcoat that. You're smart, you're a moral theologian, and I know you're a healthy man. You have a healthy family. That's a value to your family, so that you are able to do what you can do. But right now, the devil's attacking. He's using health, and
which is a fear tactic.
Yeah, it is, and it's. I don't know. I kind of digress there. What are our responsibilities of Catholics today?
Yeah. Let me make one comment from a couple statements ago, and then I'll jump into answering that question. You mentioned, being the man in the arena, and to assume an attitude, a mindset, a posture of cynicism, and the kind of tapping out mindset where it's like you talk about it as quietism, but the idea of just sort of like stepping out and I'm gonna lock myself in my bunker, or I'm gonna hunker down and just keep to myself. Those are, to quote somebody, that those are the cheap seats in the arena. Like everybody can buy the cheap seats and not affect the game at all. So I think it's really important for us to ask this question: what is our responsibility? And I would answer that question first of all by identifying some things that we should not do. And again, these are things that I've come to in my own experience as I've, So one is that we do not. I do not think we should give any time or credence, and this might be controversial, but to conspiracy theories. Because it's a temptation to Gnosticism, to have an inside knowledge, and the reality is that the evil that is hurting the world is on full display. It doesn't really matter who's conspiring, or what collusion there might be. It really doesn't matter. It's wide open. It's just in our faces, and people speak freely about what they're doing. They are promoting things that they believe sincerely are really good. And as Christians, we should see that and say, that is complete insanity. Because if we have the mind of Christ, and if we have the mind of God, we were formed deeply by our own tradition, we would just see it differently. We would just see it differently. So, you talked about the epidemic, the COVID phenomenon, like as one example. And you think, the first thing that comes to my mind is why are we so afraid of death? Like, we do not look at suffering and death in the same way. As soon as we conspire to the lie or consent to the lie that we must avoid death at all costs, we have just signed up for tyranny. That's not a Christian view of things. We don't believe that we should, that an individual human life is an absolute value. Now that's confusing. Like, what do you mean by that? Well, obviously, we don't ever take human life. We don't ever directly kill human life. But when you try to get into the business of saving every single human life from the possibility of suffering and death, you put yourself into the place of God and assign to yourself, or we assign to ourselves, an authority over evil that we don't have. And in our modern technocratic mindset, we're all over this all the time. We're going to win the war on virus. Like, seriously?
We're on
There's not
germs.
yeah, we're not. There's not a possibility that we can. We can use common sense. We can use the best science. We can use prudence and wisdom. But the strategies that have been given to us are strategies that come from a place of fear and an excessive Promethean confidence that we can have a kind of control and dominion and authority over the natural order that only God has. So common sense and prudence have gone out the window, and we just haven't been discerning. Um, you know, so I mean, I can delve more into the specifics of that if you want me to, but I just, like, as a general rule of thumb, it's like, we that's just where we are not responding as Christians from a place of the wisdom of our tradition about how we face suffering, how we face death. I compare what we live in right now to the period of the bubonic plague, and we know for a fact that we lost a lot of good holy men and women during that time period because they weren't afraid to touch and love the people that were plagued with the plague. And many of those people died, and they did that because something else was animating their lives besides fear, besides an aversion to evil. They were willing to go to places where a lot of people weren't willing to go. But you look around the world today, and so many people want to isolate and want to lock down and want to withdraw and retract, and it's like, I don't know. I mean, some of that makes some sense, but the extent to which this kind of universal solution has been overlaid across the planet, and how much people have just sort of bought into it and complied to it, it's just like for me, I think it's frightening because it comes out of a view of death and suffering as though these are things that have to be avoided and eliminated at all costs to every other good that is part of the human experience. So we now have all sorts of mental illness issues. We have people that are suffering in so many other ways because of these kind of draconian solutions that we've seen. So that's one point. Let me very quickly make a second point, and then I'll stop talking and let you take your turn. But it's the other thing that I think American Catholics are really challenged by, and it's kind of what I would call, referring back to Leo the 13th, it's the heresy of Americanism, as though our system of government, our American way of life, our Constitution are all great goods. They're tremendous fiats of human history in political economy and et cetera and et cetera, but they are not God. And we can create an idol out of the American way of life, and we can place a loyalty in our party system and put our party system before the kingdom, before the mission of Jesus in the world. And so to find Catholics divided over these very, very important issues along party lines is just disgraceful, because the Democrats or the Republicans, neither are going to deliver us from the present evil that we face right now. They have no wisdom and solution. And the Constitution of the United States is only as strong, as good as the virtue of those who seek to uphold it. And so if we don't have a grounding in our faith and really see the primacy of God in our way of life, and I'm not trying to assume that people don't believe in God. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. But I think that American Catholics have this tendency to conflate and confuse religion and politics, and too closely identify them in a way that suffers from the problem of immanentism, which is to identify the progress of God's kingdom with the progress of the political and social order. And we see that on the right and the left in our country. And so, yeah, we have to be engaged in the political realities of our country. We have to be responsible citizens. We have to vote. We have to inform our conscience. We have to do all those things. But at the end of the day, we really have to remember that, to come back to your point about Fatima and Our Lady, we have to get back to the most fundamental basics of the spiritual life, and really lean deeply into those, and allow faith, hope, and love to really come alive in us, so that we can show up in the world every day with joy, with confidence, with courage, with all the things that Christ endows us with through the Spirit.
There's a lot to chew on right there. It's so true. Even the second president, John Adams, he said the Constitution is only for a moral and a religious people. It won't survive with anything else. And it is interesting too, is that a lot of Americans forget, Catholics especially, but Americans in general, is that they always talk about this, all these freedom from the tyranny and all that. I always remember what St. John Paul II said to, I think it was Sir Ronald Reagan, when he came. Yeah, it was Sir Ronald Reagan, and I forget if it was his first visit to the United States or whatever it was, but it was one of his first times here as Pope. And he was welcome to the land of the free. And he said, free for what? We've never answered that question. And now we're at a declaration of independence 2.0, and even now we can't answer. And it's like, so, and we've created what the church has. So many popes have warned us about in the 19th, especially the 19th century. You got Leo the 13th, and getting into the 20th century, of always being cautious about a secular messianism. That's what we're having today. And in a godless culture, when we've cut off the tree of life, we cut ourselves off. Forget the fact that we were cut off from Adam, with Adam and Eve, and of course Jesus with the crucifixion gives us access, and then this progressive rejection of that for 2,000 years to where we are today. All we're left with is we've eaten it to the bitter roots, the tree of science. Mm-hmm. We tried to replace it, and here we are. Science is everything, and not only that, it's not. It's a false science. It's like now that all the real scientists who are real experts on things, they're all censored. So all we get are the lies everywhere, and then it's the culture of gaslighting. I think you're kind of alluding to that in general. Yeah. It's just these aren't the droids you're looking for. I didn't say that. Oh, I guess you didn't say that. Okay. And you just believe whatever's told you. So
is that the Jedi trick?
Yeah, it's the Jedi. It's like, wait, you said that this was going to happen. I didn't say that was going to happen. I just played you the clip. That didn't happen. And people are like, okay. It's incredible that this is not a surprise. The reality is a surprise, but the fact that this is the long drawn out fruits of this abandonment from God, and all in the name of reason, enlightenment, and everything else. And it's like the German the MEP. So she was a member of the European Parliament. She's kind of made international headlines. Christine, I forget her last name. Anyway, and she says, if the Age of Enlightenment has taught us anything, is to basically never trust your government. Because she's like, I will not receive anything that's mandated. I'm a free person. Nobody gives it to me. It's like we have to rediscover what these words mean. And this is the thing. The church has all these answers, and yet the most frightening and scandalous part is, and now the church is succumbing to these lies. And people say, well, look, if we don't do this, This is a moral obligation to receive a jab because this is an act of love. It's like people say that's the new reference point. Well, Pope Francis said that. And moral theologians who are grounded are like, that's not true. It's not true. You can't be forced that. Even the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has said that.
Right.
Anyway, it's just like this whole battle. Well, I want to shift gears because I want to take the most of our time, and it ties into this though. And it is how we've gotten to this, and the crises that we have today is because there's really a crisis in leadership. As Fulton Sheen said, the reason why we have experienced this continual collapse of civilization is largely the responsibilities of Christians who have progressively failed in living out their Christian duties. It's been a successive negation, is the phrase that he uses, of our Christian duties. And then when a decayed civilization arises, he says, in the modern world, what steps in? That's when communism steps in. They're vultures. They just look for a carcass, and then when it's ready, they just come in, and that's what we're witnessing. So this crisis in leadership, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what kind of leaders do we need, and what formation is necessary for us to be putting our efforts into that. You're the CEO and the president of the Preambula Group, which is, I like the name because it has different meanings, like your website describes it. It's like what you need before you walk. And you're out there, you're on the front lines, you're trying to engage the culture. As I like the language you use, you're talking about bridging where there's these distances, these gaps, these spaces. Well, leadership is the big one, and people they're clamoring for it. And when we don't step up, then it's all the wrong ones, and they flock to it because it's just any leadership. And that's how authoritarianism and dictatorships arise. So what do you think is most needed in leadership today? Or you can maybe just comment first on just the crisis of leadership in general.
Yeah. There's so much really to say about that. Let me go where I typically go, which is to set some context. We're sort of coming out of the modern period, and we're deeper and deeper into a postmodern moment, which is fundamentally a deconstructionist project. So everything that you see going on around us in one way or another is an attempt to deconstruct the patterns of social life from the past and to reconstruct a new reality for the future, because that's the progressivist agenda. And even a lot of the quote unquote conservatives in the political arena are still operating out of that postmodern deconstructionist mindset in one way or another. It's perhaps not as slow, but conservatives still look back to a golden era when things were better. Like, that's kind of the narrative. And progressives are looking forward to the new humanity they're going to forge. And in a sense, you have to, I think, understanding the ethos and the spirit of both of these things is really important. So, if you're coming out of a modern mindset or mentality, everything, the way of leading and the way of governing is just purely command and control, right? It's bureaucratic. Like, you create a mechanistic understanding of a social body, and you promulgate laws, and then you just execute them with absolute, perfection, and it becomes a merciless system of bureaucracy, punishment, reward, people vying for who gets to pull the levers and who has the control and the power. It's a very dysfunctional way of organizing ourselves socially. And so a good leader in that system is somebody who knows how to keep all the cogs turning and keep everybody in their place. In a postmodern world, the world's trying to deconstruct that system and tear it down and break it down, but they don't have anything to replace it with. There's no positive theory of how we ought to govern ourselves or how we ought to lead. And so I think there's a lot of interesting leadership development and reflection and thinking that's going on right now to try to figure out, well, what's the profile of a good leader? What does that look like? And again, we look to the via negativa oftentimes. Good leaders don't do the following things, right? Good leaders are able to be vulnerable. Good leaders have courage. Good leaders are willing to take risks, think outside the box. Good leaders don't just subscribe to groupthink. Good leaders take responsibility. Good leaders, don't blame other people. I mean, you could go on and on. These are all the kinds of things that emerge in terms of what a good leader looks like. I can honestly say in the church, we're still very much stuck in a command and control, top-down, bureaucratic mindset. That's how the church is governed. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. We invented it in the 1700s, Western civilization. And we are the last standing institution that fully subscribes to that way of governing and that way of leading, So, I mean, maybe that's too abstract, but the crisis of leadership that we see today is we have people that are appointed to positions of incredible authority, power, influence, and they simply do not have the formation and the tools to manage and navigate, negotiate the incredibly complex, sophisticated, and ideological environment which they find themselves in. And they just freeze a lot of times and resort to, whatever they know how to do in that environment, in that circumstance, in that situation. So to me, how do we address that as like talking about the church? How do we address that? Well, I mean, maybe this is not a helpful thing, but like we've got to look at our seminary system and our formation system. We have to look at what we're doing to really form, leaders within the church. We need to rely on lay people who have a lot of experience and expertise in the leadership space, and we have to learn from those people.
What kind of people are you talking about? Just to interject for a second, who comes to mind for those kinds of figures?
You're talking about naming names?
Well, it could be. I mean, but just as far you're talking about professionals in the sense of what you learn in the professional world, or and other things. I mean, Father Nathan, who we had on as a guest, Father Nathan Cromley, he talked about how we can learn so much in what it means to be a leader from the business professional world, because they're incorporating at their very heart and their base, in order to be successful, really Christian principles and very human principles,
yes.
But they maximize them. So like what kinds of things come to mind that when you say they're lacking, or you're thinking of, these people could fill this gap, what are they bringing to it?
Yeah, well, so I would totally affirm, what Father Nathan is saying there. And let me comment on why I think he's right, because in the very competitive environment of the marketplace, there's an immediate accountability structure built into the market. I mean, the market punishes you. And over the last, say, 3 or 4 or 5 decades, business leaders, have been forced to mine their organizations and to collaborate with each other to find ways to overcome just what we would just simply call human failure within the business community. And many of these leaders are Christian people, and so they've drawn from their knowledge of Scripture and the Bible, and they've tried to port that or infuse that into their business environments on a very human level in terms of like human values and creating healthy organizational, cultural, human systems that allow human beings to thrive. And so, everything from how to run a meeting to leaning into people's strength and gifting to how do you resolve conflict, and how do you get people invested and on board and committed. And I mean, there's all sorts of dynamics, and there's a psychology to all of that has come to the forefront of people's reflection about how to organize ourselves within human systems so that we get better outcomes on a human level, on a human plane. Like, people have to spend a lot of time at work, and they have to show up every single day. And we want the people that are working for our organization to thrive and to, I had someone who just gave me this book right here. This is by Jim Collins. How do I get it over there? No, this way. Jim Collins, Bill Lazier, Lazier, B 2.0, Beyond Entrepreneurial Leadership. I just started it, but this book so far, I mean, it's just perennial wisdom. It's just virtue ethics put into a very concrete context of running an organization. Well, the church could learn a lot from this patrimony and this wisdom, because in a sense, it's been extracted out of the Christian sapiential tradition and brought into the marketplace. And it's like, we got to bring it back. We got to bring it back into the life of the church. When we say the church is the expert in humanity, I think I said this to you before we started, what does that really mean today? Well, we have to draw down upon all of the great sciences out there that are doing some really good work on human systems, on organizational culture, on how to govern and lead others, and to maximize and optimize the human potential that exists within the church, and equip our leaders to know how to lead in that way, as opposed to a command and control approach, which is just, I'm the boss here, do what I say, and if you don't do what I'm going to haul you downtown, or I'm going to punish you in some way and marginalize you and isolate you and shame you into compliance. That tends to be the culture that we see in the church. So I don't know, I hope I answered that question to some level of satisfaction for you, but it's, you can drill down and push me on some other
it is
questions
helpful.
if you want to.
Well, it's trying to find what is needed, something more, maybe concrete. Like, you held up a book and said, look, this is something that's going to help form you in this particular way. Maybe it's adopting a certain mindset, or take a really popular one, let's say, like that book by like Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. People see the title like, oh my gosh, like I'm turned off. Catholics would be like, that's just, oh my gosh, I won't even look at it. But they don't even know what the book's about. What he does is he just goes and he goes around the world. He was commissioned to interview the most successful people in the world. And what was it that drove them and gave them that optimal ability to achieve that success? And then sharing that, you can say, their personal development, as it's known now, like wisdom, that there's a common formula that they pretty much all share, that if you apply this to anything, you could use this. I don't say you could become a really bad, like an evil person, but at the same time, you could use a discipline and become a mastermind of evil, or you could take these things. This is why, for our Christian life, grace perfects nature. This is the nature part that we completely ignore, other than we're a mess, we're this, we're that. And the theology of the body of John Paul II helped us to restore the image of who we are, which is the starting point. I think that's probably maybe the beginning of leadership formation, is that. But then where do we go from there? Where do we start to build so that we are discovering, first off, what is in our nature? Like, we don't even talk about that, other than you were talking about this before, like the negations of all that, the cynicism versus what is our potential, and how can we learn about that? And I guess that's what I'm kind of getting to. And I think this is a newer thing, is how can we, especially those who have a Catholic anthropology, begin to build that up? in conjunction with this, like you said, this perennial wisdom that has been handed down, that, I mean, it's something like little pithy sayings that we hear sometimes. Was it early to bed, early to rise makes you warm, or something healthy and wise, whatever. But it's like, that's actually true. If you look at people who do that, they almost all, it's very rare that you find people who step outside these molds. Anyway, that's kind of what I'm trying to see, if you've thought about it in the sense of what do we need to fill these gaps with? What kind of understandings, knowledge, or information from a Catholic perspective or whatever that can help us to begin to build up this, so we're not always just throwing darts in the dark and picking up this book and picking up that book, and is there any effort to systematize this to help form good Catholic leaders?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's actually a lot of good work going on in the church today in this space. I mean, you have different organizations that are trying to import this stuff into the church. There's also other organizations that are trying to import this into our other institutions, whether they're government or, I think, for example, of right now, Brene Brown. I've been reading some of her stuff and listening to some of her stuff, and like, I'll be honest, as a Catholic moral theologian, I have some real differences with some of her social stances on certain social issues. But her psychology and her understanding of leadership, built around her research on vulnerability, is very profound, and it's very Christian. And she's actually a Catholic. She's probably left to center, but she is left to center, no question. But and she's pretty left to center on a number of issues, but yet she has some really profound insights on human nature and what happens when we live out of a place of shame, and how destructive and ugly that becomes within organizational systems, whether it's the family or whether it's a business and or whatever. And it's like, you listen, you're like, yep, that's exactly the way it is. And so as a moral theologian, when I hear that stuff, I'm like, yeah, that's called sin. And we need to be redeemed from all of that. But she provides insight on a very human and psychological level, so that I can understand and know myself more deeply when I see myself operating out of shame and not out of a place of vulnerability and a sense of the dignity that I have as a child of God. Like, she helps me recognize what that looks like. And I see it in myself, and I think, Lord, have mercy on me. I need you to redeem me of these things. But that research is so valuable on a purely human level, because it gives me perspective and helps me grow in self-awareness and self-knowledge. And now I know better what I need to confess in the confessional. I don't know what I don't know. And so if I'm blind to my blind spots, a person like that can really provide insight to me. Or I think of another person that I have loved over the years is Patrick Lencioni. He's a Catholic who's done a lot of organizational culture work, and his very famous book, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and again, you read it and you're like, yeah, that's called human sin, and he puts very specific names and descriptions around behaviors that are highly dysfunctional. They come out of our sinful nature, out of our woundedness, and he gives very practical ways on how to create a healthy organizational culture, so you can optimize the mission and the goals and the activity of your organization, and really actualize the human potential that exists with your organization by removing the obstacles that stand in the way of real growth, which in our moral and theological tradition we would call sin.
Mm-hmm.
So connecting those dots, I think, is an important thing that we need to do to say, we can learn a lot from experts in particular areas of and we have to, discern. Like, for example, when I listen to Brene Brown, there's certain things where I'd be like, yeah, I don't know if that squares perfectly with our Catholic tradition, but I get what she's trying to say, and this is how I would reframe that,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe refine or nuance her point there. But, she spent 15, 20 years doing incredible research on what she's doing. And I actually said to someone the other day, of all the thought leaders, I think her work might have the most usefulness in the context of our church and our church leaders today, because, and I say this with great love, but I think I think priests are very broken right now. I think they are hurting really bad for a lot of reasons, and they're just operating a lot out of those wounds. And who is helping them? Like, who is really trying to come alongside them and invest in them and pour into them and help them find their deepest identity in Christ, to find the courage, to step out there and be the leaders that God is calling them to be. They're operating out of a lot of shame, especially because of the pre-scandals. Just walking around in a collar can be an act of, an experience of tremendous humiliation. I know a lot of priests who people just say horrible things about them to their face. I've even known priests who've had people spit in their face, just accusing them of molesting children. And for them to get up every single day and have to courageously bear that stigma, that's hard. Even if, that's just hard. And then to, step out and try to be courageous and do new and innovative things. And then someone complains to the chancery and they're hauled downtown and they're sent out to the hinterlands by the bishop and reassigned because, you're not allowed to do that. These kinds of things happen all the time. And that's why I think some of Brene Brown's work could be really helpful, because she's really, giving us a framework and a way, a language for talking about the experience of shame and the experience of fear and anxiety, and being able to find helpful, practical ways of operating out of a different mindset there and a different disposition of our hearts.
I think what you said was great, and it really ties into the major theme that we're building up within the Fulton Sheen Institute for 2022 is leadership. And how can we take the best of the world of human formation and personal development and add and combine that with the wisdom that we get through the church and through the example and wisdom of saints, many of whom we don't realize were just practical geniuses. How in the world could, yes, their faith propelled them and empowered them, but what they did, it was utterly human in working with the divine. The human brilliance, the human, the resiliency of a human spirit that drove. That's what makes the saints so awesome. Is to see their humanity so elevated through grace, where when the Jesuits were like Jesuits, to see what it took for what they pulled off, or Saint Maximilian Kolbe, these men were heavily practical. In how they accomplished what they wanted to do. They didn't sit there and just pray it away. They prayed like crazy, but my goodness, like what we could learn from them if they were to speak to businessmen, I'm sure he would wow them in the principles that it took to accomplish that. So anyway.
Well, and you just to echo what you're saying, think about the great religious orders down through history. The Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Jesuits, those were competent men. Not just holy men, but they were incredibly competent on a human level to start a movement. We can over-pietize that.
Right.
And say, I think of Mother Cabrini. What a resourceful and industrious and talented woman. She came out to Seattle and started a school out in Seattle. And I know something of the story of starting Villa Academy there. And I just think to myself, what an incredible person. Like, she was smart and she was resourceful. She knew what she was doing. So, yeah, there is a lot to learn. Unfortunately, people didn't write a lot about that side of them. They wrote about their piety and their spiritual devotions and their practices, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But they raised a lot of money. They built the foundation of all these houses for their communities all over the place. They started all these apostolates. They didn't just snap their fingers and it all fell together. It's like
Yeah.
they were very competent human beings. Hence, part of the reason God chose them and raised them up to do what they did.
So before we go, Michael, we're basically at the end of our time here. I'd just like to get really your final thoughts on how you're looking at 2022, it could be personally or just like what you see this year as being for the world. I'm calling it that this is the year of the great decision. Like the world has to decide right now because we can't sustain our path. It's not going to work, and too many things right now are too fragile, and they're escalating so big. So I think we're going to see an incredible year. I think perhaps of God doing some amazing divine intervention. I hope it's the only way to stop the madness, but also everybody's going to have to decide, because the truth on all of these things that we've been talking about and alluded to, it's all coming to light, and it just makes the devil want to dig in more. And I think he's going to go for broke even more before he's vanquished. But at the same time, it's a great awakening and decision point for everyone else. So what are your final thoughts on that? And then I'll let people know how they can follow you.
Yeah. Well, we oftentimes hear from private revelation about the illumination of conscience, and sometimes I wonder whether or not we take too literal of a sort of a interpretation of that. It feels to me that we're living through an illumination of conscience right now. It's the lots of lines are being drawn in the sand, and people are at a decision point where they have to decide, what side of history they want to be on in this present moment. And it's very interesting because it can be quite surprising where people land on that, I think. So, I think that I suspect this is going to continue into the year 2022. I'm not terribly hopeful it's going to get better, but I think things are going to continue as they go. And the Lord is going to lay bare people's hearts and people's commitments where they really land. And so, for me personally, my commitment as I roll into 2022 is to learn the lessons of the past 2 years for myself. And I've made some resolutions this year about really being more deeply rooted in my own faith and really trusting the Lord and seeking his peace and operating, living my life out of a place of peace and not in the toxic swamp that the world is right now. And being a light and doing my little part in trying to build the kingdom of God in the midst of this time and this period of great darkness. So, I don't think anything's going to resolve itself too quickly, but at the same time, I'm hoping that it doesn't get so drastic that we find ourselves in the middle of a major global war or, something horrible like that. I'm going to maintain hope that the Lord, our Heavenly Father, is merciful and will respond to the prayers of his faithful ones to stay his hand and give us some time to get out there and with greater courage to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ to everybody that we meet. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us. At the beginning of the new year, really setting, I think, a great tone, an incredible message, lots of great points. I hope people, when you watch this, you'll rewatch this, you'll send this to your friends. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what Dr. Therrien has shared with us. He knows what he's talking about. He's been immersed into the life of the church for so long. He's a faithful father, husband. He's a great Catholic friend, and he's given his life to this, and he's sharp. So don't take his words lightly, what he recommends and the things that he suggests. I think that there's a lot of wisdom there. Before we sign off officially, Michael, how can they follow your work at Preambula Group?
Yeah, so we have two websites. One is preambula.org. And I don't know if you can post this anywhere.
I can. Yeah, I'll have all this in the comment section, but I could also put it on the screen.
and the second one, so that's who we are, and what we do is it lives on another website, which is mtyr.org, and that's the acronym of More Than You Realize. So mtyr.org will give you a good snapshot of what Preambula Group does, and the Preambula site tells you who we are, and our mission statement, and our vision.
Well, can you give me your under 30-second elevator pitch on what you do? What's the heart of it?
Yeah, we've just been working on our why statement, thanks
Well,
to
here you
Simon
go.
Sinek, who's another thought leader.
Yes, I like Simon Sinek.
Yeah. So we help people encounter Jesus in the context of community. We help people explore their identity through growing self-awareness. And we help people exclaim Christ's love through authentic witness. So all of our programming tries to provide space for people to grow as Christian disciples so that they can have those three experiences.
Awesome. Well done. Good exercise there. So preambulagroup.org and mtyr.org. Okay. More than you know. Did I even get that right?
More than you realize.
More than you realize. Anyway, we'll get it right. It's on the screen. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Michael. God bless you and your family. And I do hope that we can have you back on in the not so distant future. As things get faster and faster, just a whole world can take place in the next 3 months, the big radical change. So it'd be great to have you on. I know they love people who have watched you in the past. You bring a lot of wisdom, so thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. It's always great to be with you, and let's do it again soon.
Sounds good.
All right, God bless you, brother.
Thank you.
Right is right if nobody is right. Wrong is wrong if everybody is wrong. And believe me, in this error-infested world, what we really need is a church and an authority that is right not when the world is right, but one that is right when the world is wrong.
Never in history has the prayer of the Rosary been more needed to save our families, our countries, and defeat the evils of the world than now. The Fulton Sheen Institute worked closely with the Roma Rosary to develop the most unique, beautiful, and meaningful rosary that was inspired by Fulton Sheen's World Mission Rosary. This special handcrafted rosary continues Sheen's passion to support the mission of the Church to evangelize the entire world. Each decade of the rosary has a different color, which corresponds with a different continent. Yellow for Asia, red for the Americas, white for Europe, blue for the nations of Oceania, and green for Africa. Each Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary comes with a set of 4 pure essential oil blends that have been chosen for their therapeutic and theological significance. These blends correspond to the 4 mysteries of the Rosary. Simply choose the oil for the mystery of the day, drop a small drop in the palm of your hand, and massage the oil over the surface, being sure to catch the lava beads. You're good to go, and your prayer will linger longer with these beautiful aromatic notes. Every Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary you purchase supports our mission to fight the battle for the hearts and souls of the Christian family and lead our world back to God. So visit the Fulton Sheen Institute's store and pick up your beautiful Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary today. Get one for you, your family members, and your close friends, and don't forget your pastor. Thank you so much for your prayers and your support.